The syllabus calls for today's class to be about European social democracy, which is, after all, the default position of the progressives in the world debate. But I've modified the plan in the following way. Last week, I began a discussion of the progressive alternative in the context of the United States. And I spoke about the three major structural elements of a progressive alternative in political economy. The relation of the vanguard of production, the new vanguard of production, the knowledge economy, to the rest of the economy, the relatively backward parts of production, the relation of labor to capital, and the relation of finance to production. And I added to that structural discussion a conversation about redistribution in the tax system, given that that, in fact, is almost the entirety of the actual discussion, as opposed to the discussion which I think should be predominant. And I suggested the way in which an approach to the tax system can be accessory to a structural program, but recognize its predominant importance. Today, then, instead of going directly to the discussion of European social democracy, I want to continue and complete the American discussion by adding to the account of a progressive political economy outlined last week the other elements of a progressive alternative in the American context. First, with respect to the structure of democracy, of democratic politics. Second, with respect to the organization of civil society outside the state and outside the market. Third, with respect to education, its institutional framework and its pedagogic model. And then to relate that discussion of education in turn to a larger engagement with consciousness and culture in the country. And the intangible themes of the form of sociability that must accompany such a structural reorientation. Now, before launching into this ambitious plan, let me state a few methodological precautions again, amplifying themes that I mentioned before. You know that the predominant position in the world among the progressives is that the orthodoxy, social liberalism or neoliberalism, if you like, the eviscerated form of social democracy that emerged from the collision of historical social democracy with neoliberalism, that the orthodoxy is universal or claims to have a universal application, but the heresies are local. And that is the typical view of the progressives around the world. I, on the contrary, share with Karl Marx and John Stuart Mill, with the liberals and socialists of the 19th century, the belief, the conviction that a universal orthodoxy can be successfully combated only by a universalizing heresy, as liberalism and socialism were in the 19th century. And I therefore intend this discussion of the American alternative and next week's discussion of the European alternative to be simply the American and European variants of a universalizing alternative, an alternative that is not about this country or that country, but about the whole world. The second methodological precaution is to emphasize my view that every alternative has to be understood not as a blueprint, but as a succession of steps, as a sequence, as music rather than as architecture, to return to the earlier metaphor. And that therefore any alternative could be described at points relatively closer to what exists or relatively further away from what exists. And I choose to emphasize in the discussion here an intermediate point, neither very close nor very far away, but as I pointed out in the first class, the intermediate distance from the existent, although it has the advantage of contributing to conceptual clarification, has also a great disadvantage, which is that the alternatives described at this middle distance from the existent are likely to be too far away from what exists to seem feasible, and therefore will be dismissed as utopian, but not far away enough to arouse enthusiasm and to have visionary intensity. And that is why I suggested in the first class, in the discourse of practical politics and of transformative practice, we dismiss this intermediate distance, this middle distance, and we attempt to have a language that combines the very practical with the very visionary, the close with the remote. This is the method of the political prophets, who offer a different direction, but then provide a down payment, a first installment on the direction, so that everyone can touch the wound and have some tangible, anticipated expression of the future that is proposed. Now, finally, let me say that all of this discussion about alternatives presupposes a view of structure and of how structure changes. The basic institutional arrangements of the present society and the ideological assumptions with which they are associated. We, however, do not now have a usable and defensible idea of structure. And later on in our discussion during the semester, I need to say a lot more about that. There's one point of the discussion of structure, however, that has immediate pertinence to the arguments now, and that is the rejection of the idea characteristic of classical European social theory, and especially of Marxism, the form of social theory that exercised the greatest influence on the left, that these structures are indivisible systems, which, when they change, must change all at once or not at all. And thus, what results is a binary idea of politics, that all politics is either the reformist management of one of these indivisible systems or the revolutionary substitution of one by another. I think this idea is completely false, that in fact, the total substitution of a system is just an idealized limit that never occurs in fact, in practice. And real structural change, when it happens in history, is always fragmentary. Because it is always fragmentary in its actual historical forms, it always has this ambiguity or ambivalence, that each fragmentary structural change can be a pretext or a reason not to go further, or it can be a step to the next step. And in real political experience, the meaning of everything that we do depends on what happens next. The meaning is determined by the sequence. Now then, let me come to the discussion of democratic politics of the state. In this conception of a progressive alternative, the main axes are the reorganization of the market. The crucial analytical premise is that a market order has no single natural and necessary form, and that it can be organized in radically different ways. That was the premise of my discussion last week. The organization of democracy, of the state democracy also, has no natural or obvious form. The organization of civil society outside the state and outside the market, and the organization and practice of education. All the democracies that exist in the world today are flawed or weak democracies. And weak democracies in the following senses. All of them inhibit, make difficult, the repeated practice of fragmentary but radical structural change. All of them make change, structural change, depend on crisis. And their rule is no trauma, no transformation. And all of them, therefore, perpetuate the rule of the living by the dead. By contrast, a strong democracy would be a democracy that reversed all of these consequences. It would be a democracy that facilitated the repeated practice of structural change, that weakened the dependence of change on crisis, and crisis typically in the double form of economic ruin or war, and that therefore overthrew the government of the living by the dead. And the question then is, how in the existing societies can we begin to move in that direction? And now specifically for today, how in the United States? So the first set of necessary institutional changes in the organization of democratic politics would be changes that elevate the temperature of politics, by which I mean the level of organized popular engagement in political life. The premise is that only a high temperature politics can be rich in structural content. So the elevation of the temperature of politics depends on particular arrangements that, of course, have circumstantial effects. Their efficacy depends on the historical circumstance. But let me give you some examples. So first of all, electoral regimes. To begin with something obvious, whether the vote is optional or mandatory. In many democracies, rich or developing around the world, the vote is mandatory. In the United States, only half of the people vote in a typical American election, with dramatic consequences. The mandatory vote simply means that under the sanction of a modest fine, everyone is required to vote. And under a rule of mandatory voting, the abstention has a very different significance from what it has under a rule of optional voting, because the abstention is a repudiation of the options that are presented to the electorate. No country that ever adopted a rule of mandatory voting has ever later chosen to abolish that rule. So the rule of mandatory voting can be part of the process of acquiring an enduring collective habit, which is not easily reversed. Now, in the choice between voting systems, between proportional representation, for example, and first past the post voting, there's no fixed relation between the electoral regime and the political consequence. In a society, in a polity, for example, that is highly fragmented, with many parties and with traditional parties, like, say, Italy, the abolition of proportional representation can have a mobilizing effect. But in a polity that adopts first past the post voting can be the opposite. So there's no general rule. The relation of the means of mass communication to the organized social movements and to the political parties. For example, the rule that says television time cannot be sold to the political parties, but it must be distributed for free to the parties and the social movements as a condition for the revocable licenses under which the media companies do their business. And then, of course, the rules impeding the use of private money for the financing of political activity. The accumulation of all of these rules produces an elevation of the temperature of politics, which is in turn necessary as the background to a politics with rich structural content. Now, what's the premise of this argument? The premise that has a larger theoretical significance is that we do not have to choose between a politics that is cold and institutional and a politics that is hot and anti-institutional or extra-institutional. We do not have to choose between a cold politics and Caesarism. The premise of conservative politics and of a conservative political science is that at the end of the day, you have to choose between Madison and Mussolini. The contrary premise is that you don't have to choose, that you can have a politics that is hot and institutional at the same time. Through the accumulation of these particular initiatives, like the ones that I just enumerated. Now, would someone like to discuss this first idea? So it says there's this supposed dilemma. You have to choose between the institutional and the cold, or the anti-institutional and the hot. And the claim is, no, you don't have to choose. You can have heat and institutions at the same time. You don't have to choose between Madison and Mussolini. Yes?
How can you bring this change in the first place if the institutions are so rigid and cold?
Well, that's a formidable question, right? So, because this is not a system that I'm describing, right? The different parts of this program for the creation of a hot democracy are not all or nothing. So I want to take up later in this argument the question of where one might most likely begin in the United States. So the general view of the American progressives seems to be that the best place to begin is in the rules governing the relation between money and politics. That's not my intuition. My sense is that the best place to begin is in the reinvention of American federalism, which has much wider appeal. But again, this is an empirical, circumstantial question. So you begin wherever you can. However, your question invites another remark, which is this. It's common for the progressives around the world to believe that the reformation of politics and the state comes first. It's what's sometimes described as the mother of all reforms, because it's an antecedent condition of any other transformation. I think that's completely false. No country reforms its politics in order later to decide what to do with the reform politics. The reform politics takes place only when it needs to take place. The country needs to change its social and economic direction, and it cannot do that within the stranglehold of the existing political institutions. That's when it changes its politics, only when it needs to. So that's the position that I would take on that debate. Now, any further remark about this? Yes.
I was wondering how you reconcile the two separate ideas. First axiom being that if structural change to take place, it has to take place on a sort of global structural level, but also that we need to participate in a sort of...
I lost you there. Go a little more slowly.
First thing you opened with this idea that this marks this idea that there needs to be global change for structural change to happen. And
That the regime is an indivisible system. Yes.
That European and American variants are like local heresies of that idea, but also how does that reconcile with more fragmentary politics where you are able to sort of bounce on energy, in separated economy, separated society?
But where do you see the problem? That is, this idea of total change, I'm claiming, is a fiction, is a fantasy. It's an idealized limiting case. It's not the real character of structural change. Real structural change is always more or less fragmentary. So, and many of the classic writers in political theory, for example, Tocqueville, in his book about the Ancien Regime and the French Revolution, his main theme is that France after the revolution was very similar to France before the revolution. There's a confusion of the method. If the method is violent, it can seem, well, we're breaking the system and we're creating something else. But that doesn't determine whether the change is total or not. Hegel in the Phenomenology of Mind said exactly the opposite. Violence is a characteristic expression of political impotence. It's when we can't change that then there's violence. So it's not the method of violence which reveals the totalistic character of the change. Now, do you want to restate your question?
Yes, I guess I had this understanding because for the last classes you opened up with the idea that universal orthodoxy cannot be combated with local heresies.
Yes.
For me, when I imagine fragmentary politics, I am imagining local heresies or different energies converging from within the United States.
Yes. So I think you're associating the idea of local heresies with the idea of fragmentary change. But a universal heresy is a heresy about a direction of fragmentary change. The direction is universal, but the particular changes that happen in particular contexts are not part of a system, which are enacted all at once. Like this question that we just discussed. Where would you begin if you have this objective of elevating the temperature of politics? And the answer is always going to be some circumstantial or fragmentary answer. You begin where you can begin, and you have a thesis, you have a conjecture about the relative fecundity and transformative influence of different initiatives. But you can't change everything at the same time. So the most important attributes of a programmatic argument are always the direction that it marks and the choice of the initial steps by which to begin to move in that direction. And that combination of marking the direction and choosing the initial steps is the method of transformation. And that is the method of the political prophet. The political prophet says, this is the direction, and this is the future that I invoke. But here's a down payment. Here's the first installment. You have to touch the wound in order to believe. So there has to be something tangible now, which is in some way a foreshadowing or an anticipation of that experience that the prophet proposes. And this isn't a system which he is proposing. I repeat, it's not a system, it's a direction. And the direction is exemplified, is instantiated by particular fragmentary reforms, not by another system. The prophet does not say, you have capitalism, I'll give you socialism. He says, I want to change the relation between the vanguard and the rest, between labor and capital, between finance and production in the following ways. And how much? How much can you have at one time? No one knows. But that's what's open. So the question of how big are the steps that you take in moving this direction is often mistakenly confused with the question, in what direction are these steps going? Because you could have a fundamentally different direction, but the steps by which you begin to move in those directions might be very limited. They might seem to be small. But how small or how big they are is less important than in what direction they're going. So, and that's quite a different view from the view that's evoked by a social theory like Marxism. Now, then the second set of institutional innovations has to do with the pace of politics. The first is the temperature. We say, there isn't a fixed contradiction between political mobilization and political institutionalization, as the conservative American political scientists claim. You can have political institutions that are more mobilizing, but they can be more rather than less institutional. Now comes the second point of inflection, which is the pace of politics. So, the philosopher of science, Karl Popper, said, the point in science is to make mistakes as quickly as possible. And the political equivalent to this idea is the same thing in democratic politics. The point is to make mistakes as quickly as possible. So how can you, as you heighten the temperature, how can you also accelerate the pace? And let's now take the American constitutional arrangement. So the United States organized what we can describe as a proto-democratic liberalism. That was at least the initial form of the Constitution. And they then established a cult of the Constitution. The Constitution in the United States is the object of a cult. It is revered. It is associated with a national identity. Most countries around the world have had many constitutions, but the Americans have had only one constitution. And in the United States, where it's very hard to amend the Constitution, the amendment process imposes obstacles which are almost insuperable. The characteristic way of changing the Constitution is to pretend that it meant something different from what it meant before. So the American way of changing the Constitution is not to change it, but to reinterpret it. Napoleon Bonaparte gave the following advice. He said, a constitution should be brief and obscure, but it seems that the only people who followed his advice were the American people. And they have this method of constitutional revision Now, the this preference for changing the Constitution by reinterpreting it rather than changing it by changing it has consequences of which the Americans may not be completely aware. It's very hard to pretend that when the Constitution says there are 3 branches of government, what it really means is that there are 5 branches of government. But it's relatively easy to pretend that a certain interpretation of the Due Process Clause or the Equal Protection Clause can be replaced by another interpretation. So this bias to changing the Constitution by reinterpreting it rather than changing it by changing it results in a shift, in a tilt away from structural change in the form of government, to change in the reinterpretation of rights, as in the example of the reinterpretation of equal protection or due process. So there are 2 structural principles in the American constitutional arrangements, the American constitutional regime. There's a liberal principle of the fragmentation of power in the state. There are many sources of power vested in the different branches of government and in the different parts of the state beside the branches. And there is a conservative principle of the slowing down of politics. That's Madison's scheme of checks and balances. The Americans believed that the liberal principle of the fragmentation of power and the conservative principle of the slowing down of politics are naturally and necessarily associated, but they're mistaken. They are not naturally and necessarily associated. They are associated by intention, by design, to produce the effect of inhibiting the transformation of society by politics. And it's easy to imagine how a relatively modest set of changes could have fundamental transformative effects in abolishing this conservative principle but reaffirming the liberal one. For example, you could say that if there is a stalemate between the 2 political branches, the president and the Congress, either branch would unilaterally have the constitutional prerogative of dissolving the impasse by calling early elections. However, the branch that exercised the constitutional prerogative would have to pay the political price of running the electoral risk. So the elections would always be bilateral for both political branches. But either branch could call the elections at the price of running this electoral risk. That would totally modify the logic of the regime, because the presidential regime then, instead of being a machine for the slowing down of politics, as Madison wanted, and why did he want to slow down politics? To preserve the social and economic order from the interventions of politics. You would transform the presidential regime into a machine for the acceleration of politics. So this is the second false dilemma. There's the dilemma that says you must have a politics which is either hot and institutional, that's either cold and institutional or hot and anti-institutional. And now there's one that says you must have a politics that links the liberal principle of fragmentation of power and the conservative principle of the slowing down of politics. No, you don't have to do that. You have that by choice, by intention, not by necessity or not by logic. You can choose to have one and abolish the other. And I just gave you a practical example of how you can do it. There are actually many ways in which you can do it. That's just one of them. And that example illustrates something which is very interesting in institutional design, which is that relatively small institutional changes can exert drastic effects, as in the example I just gave. Now, what about that? Would someone speak to that? Yes.
Would you have a limit on how often they can call for new elections? And then,
That's interesting. Maybe when we should have a limit, but I think most people would think that this regime that I've described would result in too much flux. I think that the more probable outcome is exactly the opposite. That the exercise of this prerogative, because it requires one of the branches to submit to elections, would be rarely exercised because it's a very large political price. If you can dissolve the impasse by subjecting the other branch to elections, but not your own, that's much easier to imagine. But if you have to say, I will also go to the people together with my opponent and let the people judge, then it seems to me that that requirement is likely to be underused rather than overused. But if it were overused, we could have a provision for limiting in some form, as you suggested.
and then also my other question was, do you think that in the US we've been moving really away from like public financing for like elections and everything, but then we, or at least in my opinion, we have had like a raising of the temperature. I don't know like the pace, but do you think we've seen any of the benefits that you think would come from like raising the like, heat of politics in the US? Like have there
Well, I think that if there's been a raising of the temperature, it's been because of the intervention of this right-wing populism. So, and this has happened in the West, it's happened in Europe. It's a characteristic of the politics of the advanced societies. So I think an underlying theme in these discussions is that the program of the right of center parties and the left of center parties in the rich Western democracies has failed. It has failed, first, to sustain socially inclusive economic growth. Second, to provide a practical basis for social cohesion or solidarity in the presence of the erosion of homogeneity by migratory flows. And third, it has failed to provide an alternative to war and economic collapse as an incitement to change, right? And you see this very clearly in Europe. So it's failed. And then the working class or petty bourgeois, the subjective petty bourgeois majority of these countries feels dispossessed and abandoned, and then they call the populist leader. And what happens? The populist leader has also no political economy, characteristically. The content of the development strategy of the right-wing populism is very close to conventional social democracy. Protectionism, constraints on planned closings, on offshoring, and so forth, restraints on migration. The only constitutional program of the populists is the strengthening of executive authority. So there's no determined structural content. So the vacuum created by the failure of the right of center and left of center parties is perpetuated under right-wing populism. That's what I say would happen. That's the only sense in which it's heated up. It's not heated up because of any of these structural changes I've described. Yes?
Why are we holding on to institutions as the vehicles of this change in the first place? Like, isn't that conservative to be so institutionalist?
As opposed to what?
As opposed to maybe seeing culture or other human
No, I think culture is very important, and I want to discuss it now in relation to the United States later on. But the institutions are how things are organized. So that's all it means. It's the structure of society. The real world, the deal. So, and what is there to change? What is there? That's what there is to change. So, the preservation or transformation of the regime, meaning the institutional arrangements and the ideological assumptions associated with, is the supreme object of political ambition in politics. Because the supreme object is either to preserve the regime or to transform it, right? And if you're not doing that, if you're not either preserving it or transforming it, all you're doing is you're in it for the beer in some way, for the advantage, for the transitory advantages of the office. But that's the object of ambition. And the supreme object of ambition in social theory is the explanation of the regime. What is a regime? How does it change? How do its parts relate to one another and so forth? So that's it. That's the whole story. And then you say quite appropriately that the regime is not just institutional arrangements. The regime are also the ideological assumptions with which the institutional arrangements are connected. But this stuff that we're discussing right now has a kind of natural priority because it's not just one more domain of institutional change. It's the domain that sets the terms on which all the other domains are transformed because the law determines the conditions for the transformation of every part of social life. Now then, the third set of institutional changes that would go in the direction of creating a strong democracy, a high-energy democracy, to replace the low-energy democracies that exist today, are changes that have to do with the relation between central power and local power, or the periphery. And here, too, we find a characteristic conservative view. The conservative view is that there is a pendular relation. It's like a hydraulic model. Either power flows to the center or power flows to the periphery. If the periphery, if the part gains more power, it must be because the center must be losing power. But I think that view is false, and that we can imagine various constitutional arrangements in which we both strengthen the hand, the opportunity for strong initiative by the central government, and allow parts of the country to deviate from the predominant solutions. So what's the general idea? The general idea is that as a republic goes down a certain path, strongly defined by one of these alternatives, it hedges its bets, allowing parts of itself to deviate from the predominant solution and to create a counter model of the national future. So the society takes a certain road. It says, this is the road we've chosen, but we can't be absolutely sure that this is the right road. So we will allow parts of our country to try out some other road on a smaller scale. And that will be a tangible example of the national alternative. Now you can imagine that this experimentalist sense could go through various stages. So the first stage is cooperative federalism. Cooperative federalism is the first stage of experimentation in the state. And cooperation, both vertical and horizontal within the federation. So cooperation between the three levels, national, state, or provincial, and local, and horizontal among the states and among the municipalities. Cooperative federalism turns out to be crucial to the solution of many problems in public policy in the state. Now you can then imagine a second stage. And the second stage is what I want to call wide divergence. So in a conventional federation, each state or each part of the country must enjoy simultaneously the right to the same level of divergence. And if the same level of divergence has to be exercised simultaneously by all the parts of the federal system, then necessarily the right of divergence has to be very limited. So in this respect, paradoxically, unitary states like France or the United Kingdom have an advantage over federations, because in a unitary state, there's no presumption that all parts of the country have to enjoy at the same time the same right of divergence. For example, in the United Kingdom, the central government can make a deal with Scotland that's different from the deal that it makes with, say, Wales. There's no presumption that it has to be the same. The coexistence of strong central initiative with this right of divergence depends on the particular way, on the details of how you shape the coexistence of divided powers and concurrent powers in the system. And of course, divergence would have to be vetted politically and judicially, because as we know from American history, this divergence, this was the question of states' rights in American history, can be used to impose oppression, racial oppression, class oppression, to transform temporary advantages into vested rights. So it would have to be vetted, it would have to be approved by the political branches of government and by the judicial authorities to prevent abuse. But it has vast experimental potential. Now, if you go back to the question that was asked there earlier in the class of where to begin, it seems to me, and it's an empirical conjecture, that that's one of the best places to begin. In the United States, the experimentalist uses of federalism, the reinvention of the federal system, because this idea has very wide appeal in the United States and crosses the divisions between right and left. And it's the basis, that is, to organize a dialectic of vanguardisms in the country is one of the best ways to begin this heating up that we discussed at the start. So in my country, in Brazil, we have these different worlds. I have a huge country, the Amazon, the West, which is the subtropical savanna, the Northeast, the South. These are all different worlds. So the only way in which the national project could come to life is to come to life through these different versions of the national future that we would have. And then this idea of cooperation and experimentalism has a transcendent significance. This is the only way in which the national program could be made real. It couldn't be made real by being some kind of imposed uniform system imposed on the whole country. And each of these regions, you have to think of each of them as a vanguard. So say, in each region, the country has a second chance. So, for example, in the Amazon, which spatially, geographically, is our largest region, people talk about sustainable development. But what does sustainable development mean? Either it is a primitive artisanal extractivism with no scale, with no technology, and therefore with no future, like the native populations taking latex from the trees. Ridiculous. It has no future. Or it is a form of the knowledge economy. And then you have to have a technological vanguard, mobilizing the resources of the tropical rainforest and establishing all the intermediate links between the green complex and the industrial urban complex. Obviously, this is a national project. This is a project that requires technological assistance and scientific assistance from the whole world, and it would be the reinvention of Brazil in a particular region. We say, here we have a second chance. In each region, we have another chance. So this third set of changes is then the institutional instrument for the promotion of that vanguardism, to transform the whole country into a dialectic of vanguards with their regional specificities. In the United States, you know, where in general there is antipathy to industrial policy, the governors, including the Republican governors, are trying to establish an industrial policy. And typically they're doing it through these regional associations, like the Western governors have a regional association. Everyone wants to have their little Silicon Valley. And the idea is absurd, right? The Silicon Valleys that they imagine are like Potemkin villages. They're facades. That's not how you establish a vanguard. But they're just, it's what they imagine as the tangible expression of their idea. And so even though the form is awkward and impractical, the impulse is extremely rich in its potential if it can take other forms in the future. And we have to imagine the institutional framework in which that can happen. Some comment about this? Yes.
I guess like thinking in terms of like the evaporations and thinking of states as sort of like a larger scale like RCTs for like I guess political innovation. Wouldn't some states be sort of self-selecting for their populations? So
Wouldn't some?
wouldn't some states be like self-selecting for their populations, like through the policies that they enact? Like, say that you have a state with like a low corporate tax, and all the businesses would start like being registered in that state, and then they say, look, we're doing really well.
I mean, there'd be like a race to the bottom. The state would offer a lower tax in order to attract people.
Well, I guess what I'm
Well, it's easy. It's because it's easy to have rules to avoid that,
okay.
as the European Union, for example, does. So that's not a necessary consequence of this experimentalism. That is, the legal regime under which these local experiments are conducted can include rules that prevent that kind of race from to the bottom from happening. So the purpose is not to make things cheaper. The purpose is to empower and equip the emergent vanguards to create new comparative advantage on the basis of inherited comparative advantage. The purpose is the creation of the new. So the old idea of regional policy is the idea we have, for example, in Italy. It's the idea of the Mezzogiorno. Subsidies. So it's compensations for relative backwardness. We know that that doesn't work. Complete disaster. What does work is to see who is emerging, who has a new idea, and to equip him. And that's a completely different idea of regional policy. And I think that in the context of the system of the federation, the idea is, it's this idea of hedging the bet that I described. We don't put all our chips in one direction. We say, we're going down this direction, but we want to have alternative ideas of how we might develop. Yes?
I see an inherent problem that the people or the institutions or the organizations that have the power to enable this experiment or empower these emerging vanguards have no interest to let them grow because they're a threat to their power, right?
Yes?
If they will, it will support something new that emerged in one of these experiments.
Yes.
Could be successful, become better than they are, and overthrow them. So what interest do current power sources have to empower these new experiments?
Well, but I mean, I don't understand. Isn't that the whole story of history? I mean, that's what everything is like. So why would anything ever change? So I think.
My question is, how do you?
But what happens in a real society, like say Brazil, is if you look region by region, of course there's a local elite, and the local elite has to preserve its position. But characteristically, the local elite feels like an orphan in the country. So the local elite regards itself as subordinated in relation to the elite of São Paulo, say. So there's a contradiction in which, yes, they want to preserve their local power vis-a-vis the local population, but they also want to liberate their region in relation to the nation, because their own fortunes depend on what happens in their region, in their world. So I think these are the contradictions with which we have to play. It's not a simple story in which all of the elites are lined up on the same side in a battalion, right? So, yes.
I think going along with that point, I feel like there are some pockets of like experimentation, specifically talking about the United States. Like, for example, Mayors for Guaranteed Income, the work that they're doing, but I think in a lot of states.
So you have to go more slowly. Speak more loudly and go more slowly.
I feel like there are a lot of pockets for experimentation. I'm thinking of like Mayors for Guaranteed Income and the work that they're doing, especially in the South.
Yes.
What I've noticed at like local government levels, they can get the pilots, but they can't sustain them past what these companies can do. So like, I think going to your question, what's the sustaining power after the experience?
Yes. Well, the sustaining power comes when you do something locally or not so locally. These regions I was talking about in Brazil they're vast. The Amazon is bigger than Europe. So we're not talking about a little place. So you then have to marshal a set of interests that then sees that's a future for them also. And that then complicates the whole picture. And especially given this other idea introduced before, let me return to this, because this is a unifying theme in many of our discussions. I'll restate the idea. In most of the large populous countries in the world today, the majority of people are poor and disorganized, but their horizon of aspiration is not proletarian. Their horizon of aspiration is petty bourgeois. So the majority in the world today are not Marx's industrial proletariat. The majority is what you could call the subjective petty bourgeoisie. So in other words, they don't themselves belong to the small business class. But their dream, their aspiration, is to have a small plot of land, a little store, a trade, for which they can charge a fee. It's the petty bourgeois dream. Isolated, archaic family business is the characteristic aspiration of the majority of humanity. And so that then creates a problem and an opportunity in all of these countries. That dream cannot be the basis of a growth miracle for the country, right? It leads nowhere. At best, it can be a sustaining operation for that little world. So what would be necessary then would be for there to be a division within the national elite. Every growth miracle in the last 250 years in world history depends on a struggle within the elites. There has to be a dissonant elite, a counter elite, with a nationalist and productivist commitment opposed to the rentiers, to the neo-colonial rentiers. And this nationalist and productivist counter elite has to then seek support in the popular majority, which is, as I say, not proletarian, but would be petty bourgeois, and offer them an alternative that would work. So the archaic, isolated family business based on self-exploitation and family saving won't work. What will work? How can you be part of this movement towards a knowledge economy in a decentralized or democratized form? That's then the beginning of a national debate. But I think that that national debate can only come to life if there are many different experiments around the country, and thus the significance of this reinvention of federalism. It can't be just a doctrinal debate. It has to be manifest in these petty rebellions multiplied around the country and taking a multitude of practical forms. Yes?
I think the basic question is whether to start with institutions or, as the Marxists claim, to say that if you don't change the social relations that underlie these institutions, eventually you won't do anything. And people like Karl Clare, for instance, try to argue against changes within institutions like the labor law in the 30s and the 40s that were very prominent but eventually didn't lead to any significant change regarding the division or the distribution of total wealth between labor and capital.
Uh-huh.
So
But what's the conclusion then?
this is a challenge. If you change the institutions, how you ensure that it will go to the direction that you want it to go, or whether you should start with changing the social relations that underlie the current structure of the institutions.
I don't understand that contrast that you just drew between the social relations and the institutions. The institutions shape the social relations. How can you change the social relations without changing the institutions?
But the institutions may shape the social relations, but they also represent and express the current structure of social relations, right?
There are behavioral patterns that result from the established institutions and collective habits, to be sure. But how do you break this circle, right, in which the institutions create collective habits, the habits sustain the institutions? It's because obviously the institutions suppress certain interests or possibilities that people want. So this drama of the subjective petty bourgeoisie, they want something that they're not going to get. And so then someone has to show them or offer them another option or another set of options. That then becomes the opportunity for the change.
Is it just a matter of someone, is it just a matter of like someone hasn't as of now showed them the right option, or is there something more fundamental to the structure of the institution
I'm not sure what this more fundamental element is. So the question that you raise seems to be a question about hope. How do you become hopeful? People generally think that hope is the condition of action. It's not true. Hope is primarily the consequence of action. So it's by acting and generating a new set of actionable possibilities that you become hopeful, because then you see that there's contradiction in the world. You create, and that's what generates hope. Because it seems to me that you're invoking this idea that the institutions are our fate. How do we escape our fate? But we obviously do escape our fate because things change, right? So the world is organized to reproduce itself. The world is not organized to change itself. So whenever you set a transformative task, you ask yourself, who is the agent for this task? The agent never exists, because all of the agents that exist in the world are there for the benefit of the reproduction of the world. So in order for there to be an agent for the transformative task, you have to, as it were, kidnap one of those agents and convert him into something else. So he has to become temporarily the incongruous agent of a task for which he wasn't designed. He was designed to reproduce the world. That's what everyone is designed for.
So how do we do that?
But that's the stuff of history. That's personal conversion, transformation, conflict. Through conflict, hope. You create new agents, new possibilities. That's the real thing.
Right, but at least within the Marxist tradition, you can disagree with that. But the Marxist tradition kind of wants to say that.
No, the Marxist position says, on the question of agency, let's take the Marxist idea of agency, because this is really a problem about the agent. So the Marxist idea of agent is that the more intense class conflict and the wider its scope, the more clearly you discover what your objective class interests are. And the punishment, if you make a mistake about your class interests, is political defeat. I think that's the exact opposite of the truth. The truth is that the more intense conflict is, the more the question, what are my interests as a member of a certain class, becomes inseparable from the question, what are the alternatives? Who would I become under these alternatives, and what would then be my interest? So the question, what are my interests, as conflict escalates, becomes inseparable from the question, what are the accessible alternatives? What are the theirs to which I can get from here? And so the objectivity of class interests, rather than becoming clearer, becomes less clear and begins to dissolve under the pressure of expanding conflict. The notion that the class interests are obvious is an illusion dependent on political stagnation. Stagnation in the conflict of alternatives. What is the real interest of this majority that I just call the subjective petty bourgeoisie? So they want to belong to a small business class, but they won't. The majority will never become a small business class. So they think that their interest is to be the small business class, but there isn't enough space or wealth in the world for the majority of humanity to become the owners of little farms and shops and so forth. So that they have to discover through action and disappointment and defeat and failure that what they wanted is impossible, so that they can have it in a higher form, in another form. So they had an idea of what their fate is, but it was a false idea. And that's the pedagogy of conflict and history of struggle, which we all have in a different form. We have an idea of our salvation, but it turns out to be the wrong idea. And then through suffering and conflict and contradiction, we discover something else. So my description is not intended to be the description of another fate like Marx's fate. Because at the end of the day, what Marx said is, we don't need to have a project, because history has a project for us. And if we insist on trying to have our project, we'll break our face against the wall, right? So we have to see what the project is that history has prepared for us. Now, I think history doesn't have a project for us. History only has trouble for us, but it doesn't have a project. And the project we have to discover along the way through conflict. It's a different idea. But I appreciate the question you have, which is a very fundamental question. Now, there's a fourth set of innovations. I'm going much more slowly than I had intended, but I should have expected it. A fourth set of institutional innovations deals with the following problem. If there is in society a group, a class, or a race, or some combination of these things, which finds itself entangled in a circumstance of exclusion or disadvantage, from which it is unable to escape by the forms of collective economic and political action that are available to it. So then the democracy, the strong democracy, should be able to come to the rescue of that group and release it from its bondage, from that circumstance of exclusion from which it is unable to escape. So that's the general idea. And it requires then that the state have a way of intervening that is structural but localized. Now, no part of the contemporary state is organized for that, because after all, the legislation operates through general norms. It's not localized, it's not episodic. And I'm describing a task for which apparently there is no agent in the state. There is no agent equipped, legitimated, resource funded to do a form of reconstruction that is structural but localized. Now, so that this not seem so strange and mysterious, let me say that in the United States, this is a well-known problem, but under a completely different label. It is the problem that was dealt with in American public law as the structural injunctions or the complex enforcement. So in a certain period of the evolution of American liberalism and of the judiciary, when the American liberals took command of the commanding heights of the federal judiciary, the judges started to intervene in school systems, in prison systems, in mental hospitals, because these were viewed from the standpoint of an anti-subjugation ideal as contradicting an ideal attributed to the law. This is the ambitious idea of the law, anti-discrimination law, for example, and saying there's a whole area of social practice which contradicts the ideal that we attribute to law. And it was necessary then to invent a different kind of adjudication and a different kind of litigation. The agents would no longer be individual agents possessing certain rights. The agents would be groups, segments of races or of classes. The evil to be addressed was not the violation of a particular right. The evil to be addressed was the systematic suppression of the practical conditions for the enjoyment of rights, of a set of rights. And the remedy was not then to reestablish the right in its sphere. The remedy was to invade part of the causal background of social life and to fix it. To fix the school system, to fix the prison system, to fix the mental hospital. So that's what these progressive federal judges began to do in the closing decades of the past century in the United States. So they were acting as the self-appointed instruments of this practice that I'm describing, in which the change is structural, but episodic or localized. It's not structural and general. And there is no agent equipped, funded, designated to do it. So what happened in effect in the United States is the judges say, we'll do it. And why did they do it? They did it because they wanted to do it. So until they ran out of power, right? That's the simple explanation. So you could say there are two contrary ideas about the procedural justification for this process. One idea says, if the substantive law gives a mandate, in this case an anti-subjugation mandate, carry out the mandate, whether or not there is a legitimate agent under the procedural system to carry it out. The opposing principle says, only carry out a mandate of substantive law when there is an appropriate role agent for it. So what did the judges do? They arbitrarily split the difference between these two opposing principles. They neither said that the availability of a legitimate and well-equipped agent must condition the activity, nor did they deny altogether any significance to institutional propriety and ability. They started with these relatively marginal institutions like prisons and insane asylums. And why did they start with the marginal institutions? Why didn't they take the central institutions? Why didn't they take the banks, for example? The obvious answer is because they couldn't, right? So they couldn't get away with that. But in dealing with schools and prisons, they could get away with that. This is a realistic, unsentimental account of what actually happened. So now what would be desirable? What would be desirable is that the stage of having an incongruous agent, unequipped, unlegitimated, unprepared for this activity of transformation that is structural but localized, would be a brief transitory moment. And then we would form another agent. We'd say there would be a part of the state specifically equipped, legitimated, and financed to do this work of change that is localized but structural, to come to the aid, to the rescue of a group that finds itself in a circumstance of exclusion or disadvantage from which it is unable to escape by the forms of collective action that are available to us. So the Republic will go to the rescue of that group, and there'll be a part of the state designed to do that. That part of the state might be elected directly by the citizens, or might be chosen by the political branches, We could imagine any number of ways of doing it. We wouldn't require judges to do that, as they did in Congressly in the United States. We would form another branch of government. Yes.
Just like looking at this part and like especially talking about like that we like that the electorate like come to the rescue of a group, I feel like that's kind of ignoring how much like the structural inequalities is because it's made that way, and like that people in power are just gonna want to keep power. They're not gonna like just like randomly go against their own interests, especially like in the U.S. It's so like structured. So
Yes, but then, yes, of course they were going to want to keep power. Then why did these judges do all of this stuff?
well, I feel like when in your first book you were saying somewhere that the judiciary is counter-majoritarian, but I don't believe that. I think that they're very much aligned with like general views.
And just to add to that, I think the idea of episodic with structural change through progressive judging seems a bit unconvincing to me, because I feel like it can be episodic change in that it's some minor concessions from the system that we have, but I'm not sure the act of judging, however progressive it might be, can actually lead to structural change. And I think anyone who's been in a court or who's engaged with
But wait a minute, I'm offering this fourth innovation here as an example of a particular structural change. So I'm saying this is to create a strong democracy. It's not enough to have a solution for everything. People don't become emancipated uniformly. So there can be a part of the population that finds itself in a circumstance of disadvantage from which it can't escape. And so then you go and you say you help them. That's the basic, that's what the judges did in that historical period. Now you're saying it's impossible, how could it ever happen? But it did happen. It happens because in these societies, there are conflicting interests, conflicting ideologies. There's not just one idea and everyone marching in lockstep to the same idea. Yes.
But I think that's part. I think a lot of ours was driven through like interest convergence. Like we made these changes because like white people thought temporarily it was going to help them in the short run, and then that goes back to our question we were talking about earlier, like how do you sustain things? And I feel like I don't know. I feel like
It depends. Why did people reform the prison systems? Because they were regarded as nightmares, as embarrassments to the United States, as forms of subjugation where people were almost tortured in these places. And they said, that goes too far. We won't have this in our country. So,
now we just like made our prisons kind of like out of sight, out of mind, and still are. Just like I guess that's where I do agree with you with that.
So-
one, like,
so
race
I-
for, like geopolitics to get it back in our
but let me entertain your idea then. What is its conclusion? What is the conclusion that you reach from this line of reasoning? So change, it's like Trotsky says, change is combined and uneven. You change where you can, little parts, and the little part inspires something else. That's the nature of change. So if you take the position is piecemeal change is useless unless you change everything, that leaves you with no exit, right? Because that's not the world that we're in. That's not the real world. Then we're back to the discussion of the nature of structural change. It's either everything or it's nothing.
I don't disagree with the fact that everything is piecemeal change. I feel like this just is.
You think it's futile in some way.
No, I think this just isn't getting at the roots of what is kind of wrong with the U.S. institution and like U.S. overall. I feel like we're missing, bless you, I feel like we're missing like, I don't know if we're missing it, but I feel like there's a big gap by just like.
So let me step back. Let me.
Sexism or something.
Yeah. So.
Not really, or like the fact that like the system is operating how it was meant to, that I feel like
Well, I think we have to give a name to what we're missing. That's crucial. So, and I stated my idea about that at the beginning of this class. I said, it's a mistake to think that any country is going to reform its politics in order later to decide what to do with the reform politics. So if anything has causal primacy, it's the redirection of political economy, of the market. It's the relation of the vanguard of production to the rest, like now in the United States. There's the vanguard of the knowledge economy. To simplify, everyone else is condemned to some kind of make work. So there's the vanguard. There are the people who assist the vanguard as lawyers, accountants, paper pushers of different kinds, management consultants. That's 2/3 of the graduating class of Harvard College, for example, is going to go into that. And then there's the rest of the country that is make work. So that has to be changed. That's an example. These changes in the state don't mean anything unless they're being driven by a struggle over that. That's true. If that's the point, I agree with you. But what I don't agree with is the idea that there's some mysterious quantum that we can't name that is responsible for all of this. We have to name it. We have to understand it. If we don't understand it, we can't act on it. So let's turn on the lights and let's discuss what the issue is. That's the debate that we need. So we can be mistaken about that, but it's better to be mistaken than not to try. We just have to make our mistakes quickly, as in Popper's principle. Any further remarks on this? So let me put aside then this momentous discussion of the transformation of democracy and simply say, my understanding is that the combination of institutional changes like these that I described is what I mean by the substitution of a weak democracy by a strong democracy. And the strong democracy then results in this situation in which the impulse to transformation is, as it were, rendered endogenous. So one of the signs of a weak democracy is that we need a war or we need an economic collapse to make change possible. Franklin Roosevelt had as his allies the most total war in human history and the most absolute depression. And even then he had trouble because the system, the constitutional arrangements, were arranged to give him trouble. So a mark of a strong democracy is that it diminishes this dependence of transformation on trauma and renders this impulse to transformation internal to the life of the people. Now, is this a kind of perpetual motion machine that will save us from disaster? No. Could the system not go off the rail in any number of ways? Of course it can. And in this light, we have to remember the principle of a great philosopher, Alfred North Whitehead, said, the business of the future is to be dangerous. And nothing is going to be a guarantee against that. That is the idea that we can create this perpetual motion machine in politics that can secure us against disaster is an illusion. And what happens in liberal political theory is we have this idea that there's an impersonal system of right, the neutral order. And the neutral order is always claimed in favor of its opposite. That is, the principle that is claimed to be neutral is entrenched against attack. So it becomes the opposite. So the false liberal idea of neutrality has a kinship to another idea that is legitimate and in fact indispensable, which is that a form of social life should be open to a wide range of contradiction, and above all, it should be corrigible. It should be corrigible in the light of experience. So, contradiction and corrigibility are the legitimate counterparts to the illegitimate idea of neutrality. Now, one more area of institutional transformation is civil society, outside the state and outside the market. And the starting point is a simple claim. A disorganized society cannot generate alternatives or act on them. So civil society has to be organized. The most important motor of organization in civil society comes from the way the economy is organized and the way democracy is organized. So a high energy democracy and a knowledge economy for the many and inclusive vanguardism both require a heightening of the level of association, an accumulation of social capital, an elevation in the economy of the level of discretionary initiative and reciprocal trust, demanded and required of all participants in the process of production. But the question is whether, in addition to this incentive to accumulation of social capital that comes from the economy and from politics, there's also something in civil society itself that would contribute. And now let me state again two ideas that go in this direction. So the first has to do with the provision of public services. So through the provision of public services, including services of health and education, civil society builds itself. It builds its own future. Now, what do we have in the world by way of the provision of public services? What we have is what you could call an administrative Fordism. So I say administrative Fordism by analogy to industrial Fordism, which is conventional industry. Conventional industry is the production of large-scale, standardized goods and services with rigid machines and production processes, semi-skilled labor, and very specialized and hierarchical relations of production. The form of public services that prevails in the world, and especially in all the social democracies that do provide a high level of public services to their citizens, could be described as an administrative Fordism, because it consists in the provision of standardized, low-quality public services by the bureaucratic apparatus of the state to the citizens. And low quality means simply of lower quality than the comparable services that can be bought on the market by someone who has money. That's what it means. And that's what we have. That's the dominant model of the provision of public services in the world. And the only alternative to that model seems to be the privatization of public services in favor of profit-driven firms. However, there is another alternative, and this other alternative is likely to become increasingly important in the course of the 20th century, of the 21st century. The alternative is that The state provides a universal minimum of public services to all the citizens. Let's call that the floor. And simultaneously, the state operates at the ceiling in the development of the costliest and most complex public services. But in the broad middle area between the floor and the ceiling, the state partners with civil society in the decentralized, participatory, and experimental provision of these public services. So the state helps finance civil society, it equips civil society, it trains civil society, and it monitors the participation of civil society together with the state in the provision of public service. And I want to say, this is simultaneously one of the most promising ways to enhance the quality of the public services by engaging civil society through cooperatives, not for profit, in the provision of public services. And at the same time, to encourage the self-organization of civil society outside the state. Now then there's a second example, or a second instrument, you say. Every able-bodied adult in these contemporary societies should have two positions in the system of production and skilling. Every able-bodied adult should have a position in the production system, but every able-bodied adult should share in the responsibility to take care of other people outside the family. So the responsibility of social solidarity, of caring for others, should not have the boundary of family selfishness. It should be carried beyond the family. Now, let me give you an example of how this principle might be instituted through social service. So in a republic, there should not be a volunteer army, a paid army. A paid army is a degeneration of Republican principle. A paid army in a class society means that you're going to have an army of poor people to fight wars for rich people. Conscription is a necessary Republican principle. But in many societies, the army should always be the nation in arms, and not part of the nation paid for by the other parts to defend them. But in most societies in the world, it's not necessary to have all the young people of a certain age as the cohort of the active army. So then you could say, all the people dispensed from mandatory military service, men and women, should then be subject to mandatory social service. And the mandatory social service should in principle be offered in a different part of the country and in a different sector from the sector and part of the country from which the young person comes. So then they participate in the building of the country. They receive elementary military training during that period so they can compose a reserve force. They can be mobilized in the event of a defense emergency. So under institutionally conservative social democracy, the residual form of social solidarity is money transfers organized by the state against the background of a high level of ethnic, cultural, and religious homogeneity. And that's what you have in Europe. So the European nations, where most of them like tribes, of similar people. They looked alike, they spoke alike, they had the same religion, the same habits. And now migratory flows erode this basis of homogeneity and make manifest the inadequacy of money as social cement. The only adequate basis for social cohesion in a society which cannot draw on this restrictive basis of homogeneity is engagement of people in other people's lives. And this is the principle that stands behind the idea of mandatory social service. So I'm giving just two examples of how the self-organization of society outside the state and outside the market might be instituted. Now let me just complete the argument today by one final element, which is education, which in turn will lead us into the discussion of consciousness, ideology, and culture. So especially in any country that is large, very unequal, and federal in structure, like the United States, the task will be to reconcile the local management of the schools by the states and municipalities with national standards of investment and quality. The democratic principle has to be that the quality of the education that a young person receives cannot depend on the happenstance of where it's born. So in the United States, you all know that school finance depends predominantly on local finance. So rich communities have relatively good schools, poor communities have bad schools, and so forth. And there is a severe educational dualism in the United States, a division between the mass of schools and an elite of private schools and a few good public schools. So in order to reconcile national standards of investment and quality with local management of the school, you need three things. You need a way of finding out what works, school by school and student by student. You need a mechanism of redistribution to transfer resources and staff from richer places to poor places. And you need a corrective procedural mechanism to take over temporarily local failing school systems, to fix them, and to return them fixed, like a procedure, say, in a Chapter 11 bankruptcy in the United States. So let's say that's the institutional framework, but that's not the most important part. The most important part has to do with the pedagogic model, with the method of teaching and learning. And what is the method of teaching and learning that is suitable to a contemporary democracy? So in the United States, there was a great educational reformer, John Dewey, who had a tremendous influence on American education. The Americans accepted part of Dewey's program and rejected the other part. The part that they accepted was the part about analytical problem solving combined with cooperative discussion. All the advanced tier, the top tier of American education assimilated Dewey's message, half of his message. That was the half that they accepted. The other half about the criticism of social institutions and contemporary culture, they of course rejected. And it seems that this second half, the half that they rejected, was replaced by the attempt to acquire a particular style of sociability, which is the real object of ambition in many of these educational students. So a way of characterizing it would be like this. The student is supposed to cast over his fellows a halo of seductive charisma, but at the same time to conceal it. So he should participate in the discussion, in this collective work, in this teamwork, and cast this glow of magnetic attraction on his fellows, but in a self-effacing way. And because this is judged to be necessary to successful performance in the American professional and business class. So that's what they did. And what should be then the model of teaching and learning suitable to a democracy? So I would say it should have the following elements. First, it should privilege the capabilities of the imagination, analysis and synthesis over dead information, as do we recommend it. The crucial thing always in understanding is understanding of transformation. To understand any phenomenon is to understand what it can next become in the realm of the adjacent possible. That's what understanding means. And everything in education should be focused on that. The object is not to make the mind of the student a mirror of the encyclopedia. Nevertheless, and now we come to the second principle, these capabilities can only be acquired dealing with content, not in a vacuum of content. But what matters with respect to content is selective depth rather than encyclopedic superficiality. So that's the justification for a form of education that is thematic or project-oriented. Third, the social basis of education should be cooperation. The method of advanced science. Cooperation among students, among teachers, between teachers and students, among schools. Constant cooperation. Fourth, the ideal of classical education should be reinvented. So for the Chinese, it was education in the Confucianist classics. For the Europeans, it was education in the Greek and Roman classics. The basic idea is that there would always be a second eye. So you would have one vision of your own culture, and then you would have a vision of another culture that nevertheless had a genealogical relation to the culture you were in. So the way to preserve this idea is drastically to diversify the canon. So the problem is the uniformity, the exclusivity and uniformity of the canon rather than the idea itself. And now we come to the fifth element of this model of education, which is the most important. Nothing should be taught just once. Everything in school from the earliest stages should be taught at least twice from contrasting points of view. And if we abandon the notion of encyclopedic coverage, then we have time for that. So this is the only way to liberate and empower the mind, is to expose students from very early on to the plurality of views. And in this way to immunize them against the intellectual servility which they can expect when they reach the highest stages of education in the university, already emasculated by their prior educational experience. And of course, such a vision of education cannot be imposed on a country by a cadre of educational despots at the center. It has to be a collective work of thousands of teachers, hundreds of schools. It has to be a national movement of liberation, for which there is a great opportunity in contemporary societies. Now, this is what I wanted to say by way of introducing institutional alternatives in the American context, but there's one part that's still missing of the American discussion, so I'm going to reserve the initial part of the next class to that, And that's the discussion of culture and ideology, of consciousness, without which all of the institutional stuff is dead. So we'll continue next week.